أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Many Muslims, when you look at the television or read the newspapers or etc., they complain about the difficulties that they are facing in this country in practicing their religion. And I marvel at their lack of faith. I tried to look for a softer word, but there isn't one. And I'm reminded of those people who embraced Islam in this country at the turn of the last century. Not only this country, but other places as well. I mentioned one person, Mr. Webb, who was an American and he embraced Islam. And he was the only Muslim in the whole of America. And he remained a Muslim to his dying days. And he had to do everything. He had to work out the times of prayers. He had to work out the times of fasting. He had to work out when fasting began and when fasting ended. And what sort of Eid do you think he had? Himself and perhaps his family. And yet he carried on. He left a will in which he said he is a Muslim and this is how his funeral is to be conducted and how he is to be buried. And the man wasn't, he was a prominent person before he became a Muslim. As I said, he was the American ambassador to Philippines. So he must have had, his family must have had some clout with the administration. It brings to mind, closer to our time, another member of our Jamaat, that his family are all Jews and his father is a property developer. And he said to his father that I'm going to embrace Islam. And his father threw him out of the house, chucked him out of his office, cut him out of his will. And this man, this white person, if he'd waited until his father's death, he would have inherited tens of millions of dollars. He had a comfortable, he was a project manager. His father said, go to Stanley Avenue, knock down that pub and put up, 18 flats. And he sat in his office and made telephone calls and got estimates and so on and ordered bulldozers and tipper trucks and God knows what else you have and so on. And you know what he does now? He's a carpenter. Because that was, when he got into his father's building business, that was the trade he learned. Carpentry. And he's quite happy. And he does more for the propagation of Islam than perhaps 100 Muslims put together. Come Zohar time, he puts his fingers down. He says, sorry, it's time for my prayer. You want to sack me, sack me. And he goes and says his prayers. And same for Asr and so on and so on. Do you think he is not facing the same difficulty? Do you think he is not facing more difficulties than those of us who are born Muslims? Especially at this time, when because of the problems in Israel, Muslims and Jews are at loggerheads, fighting each other and in America there is widespread support for the state of Israel. And he is always getting into fights. fighting the corner for Palestinians and so on and so forth. In I think it was 62, the late Maulana Tufal received a telephone call from Scotland. I think it was a lady called, I think her name was Lady Zainab Hamilton. She had died. And they said she died. We opened her will. We knew she was a Muslim, they said. And in it she left specific instructions. I'm not to be buried by any Christian foundry. No Christian traditional ritual is to be done. Ring the Imam, whoever he is, of the mosque at Woking, ask him to come down and perform my funeral prayer. She was the only Muslim at that time in Scotland. And to her dying day, she was a Muslim, and even for her funeral, she left these instructions. 1962 was people may not remember, was a bad winter. You know, the 3 foot of snow outside on the pavement, and the trains had stopped and everything had stopped, and Maulana Tufal had to make his way all the way up to Scotland. But before that, I mean, at that time there was still, a few Muslims and so on. There's a person called, I think his name was Quillen. He lived in Liverpool. He was a solicitor. He embraced Islam. He was stoned as he went about. Not only did he embrace Islam, but he actually adopted the complete Muslim garb. He would go out into the street wearing clothes that Muslim men in Arab country, or I think it was Turkey actually, would wear with a fez cap and so on and so forth. He insisted in appearing in courts wearing those things. When he went out of his house, he would be stoned. A mob gathered round his house and set it on fire, and he had to run for his life. That single man, he would work all day, he would go home, and he brought out 2 papers. One, I think, was a fortnightly, and one was a quarterly. And out of the money that he earned, he would distribute those newspapers to all members of the House of Lords, members of the House of Commons. He would write to newspapers supporting in those days, you remember, there was a lot of opposition to Turkey and Khilafat and all these other issues. Remember the First World War. During the First World War, Turks had sided with the Germans and fought the British and so on and so forth. And yet even at that time, he would support Turkey's cause, despite the fact that he would be stoned, despite the fact that his house would be, they tried to burn down his house with him in it. And I saw somewhere in one of the old newspapers that used to be printed at the time of the promised Messiah alayhi salam, that Hazrat Sahib printed advertisements for this person's newspapers and said he's on his own. Help him, subscribe to his newspapers, send him subscriptions, do something for this man, because he's the only one in England fighting the cause of Islam and Muslims, really. And he managed to, through his efforts, create a small Muslim community in Liverpool. And then something happened in mysterious circumstances, and that community seemed to dissipate for some reason. And he then allied himself with the Working Muslim Mission, etc. And he used to write in the Islamic Review. But when Muslims today, when there are millions of us in England, say, I've got a problem, I say to them, your problem is your lack of faith. If people like Alexander Russell Webb and Quillen could embrace Islam and face their communities in their own country without any resources, what is your problem that you can't solve. I'll stop here.